Patterns emerge from the study of history that help prepare soldiers for the impact of combat, the complexity of logistical operations, and the problems of leadership. And history also shows the impact that a single courageous individual can have on the course of battle. In fact, the failure to understand history will certainly doom us to repeat the failures of the past. This program's about history, but it's not a history lesson. This is a story of men fighting for their country and for causes greater than themselves. In our nation's history, few events have had such significance as those which took place in France on the beaches of Normandy 40 years ago. Facing seemingly insurmountable odds, the Allies conducted one of the most complex operations in the history of warfare. On the morning of June the 6th, 1944, United States paratroopers jumped into the pre-dawn skies over France, and Army gliders swept into the meadows with glider-borne soldiers, and some of those gliders would careen into the hedgerows tragically. From landing craft, American soldiers stepped into the English Channel, and after struggling ashore, had to claw their way across the beaches through obstacles and minefields. They were faced with withering fire delivered by a determined enemy. As they fought their way over the long beaches and secured airborne objectives, they made names like Omaha, Utah, and St. Mary Glees part of the proud heritage of the United States Army. What you're about to see is their story. It's the story of the American soldier. Their valor is your heritage.
It's quiet and peaceful here now, but 40 years ago, this was the site of the largest, most complicated invasion in the history of warfare. The landings on these beaches in June of 1944 provided the Allies with a vital foothold in Western Europe that would lead to ultimate victory in World War II. How the operation was accomplished by soldiers like you, and what it means in terms of today's Army, is the subject of this special report.
Soldiers Television Magazine presents D-Day, A Soldier's Battle. Here is correspondent Peter Hackus.
A massive invasion of Western Europe was first considered 4 years before D-Day, following the fall of France to the Nazis. British and French soldiers who were driven into the sea at Dunkirk vowed to return to the European continent in force. Following America's entry into the war, military strategists from the U.S. and Britain began planning a large-scale invasion across the English Channel. Though it was generally agreed the invasion was necessary to push the enemy out of Western Europe, many different proposals were made to accomplish this objective. It was not until January of 1944 that a staff of Allied officers began meeting in this building in London to finalize and carry out the long-awaited operation, codenamed Overlord.
The staff, headed by American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, was to organize and deploy the Allied Expeditionary Force. That force would eventually consist of some 6 million soldiers, sailors, airmen, and support personnel, almost 7,000 ships and landing craft, and nearly 10,000 aircraft. The task facing Eisenhower and his staff seemed enormous, almost unimaginable. In the span of 5 short months, land, sea, and air forces had to be marshaled, equipped, and briefed for an assault against 1 million enemy troops and their heavily fortified emplacements on the Normandy coast. The plan called for simultaneous landings by American, British, and Canadian soldiers along a 60-mile stretch of French coastline between Cherbourg and Le Havre. The operation would be extremely dangerous, requiring split-second timing and concentrated support from sea and air units. But even before final details of the plan were agreed upon, Allied units began a rigorous training schedule on the beaches of Britain. As D-Day approached, full-scale rehearsals were held, not only to test each unit's ability to assault and secure a specific objective, but also to ensure proper coordination among all units involved. The training was tough and realistic. Some said it was almost harder than D-Day itself. Though some of the Americans were veterans of the Italian and North African campaigns, many were untested in combat. Their training in the States and their grit and determination would spell the difference between success and failure.
While the combat troops were sharpening their assault skills, logistics and support personnel were preparing the thousands of vessels needed to transport and protect the landing forces on D-Day. Harbors like this one throughout England and Scotland were choked with ships of every size and type. From the largest battleship to the smallest landing craft, each was preparing for battle.
All of southern England became one vast staging area, as vehicles, equipment, weapons, and supplies were moved toward the ports. Mechanics, supply clerks, MPs, and drivers were as vital to this part of the operation as the foot soldier would be to the coming invasion. One official described it as moving a large city across the English Channel and keeping it going on the other side. Following the tons of supplies and equipment came the combat troops, breaking camp at more than 1,100 locations in Great Britain. Americans, Englishmen, Canadians, and Frenchmen, regulars, reservists, and guardsmen. They were cheered by thousands of British citizens as they headed toward their ships and an uncertain future. Many were already at sea in transit from the United States or on warships that would protect and support the assault forces. In all, more than 2 million people were involved in the embarkation process. All it would have taken was one loose tongue to pass the time and place of the invasion to the enemy, to give them the edge and create disaster for the Allies. But security was tight. The secret was kept.
Even with the element of surprise on their side, what the Allies faced here on the coast of Normandy was formidable indeed. The Atlantic Wall, as Hitler called it, was the western defense of his European fortress.
Its cliffs and concrete barriers bristled with flak batteries, machine gun nests, and artillery with a range of more than 5 miles. Its beaches were littered with mines, hedgehogs, and barbed wire. It was manned by troops that outnumbered the Allied force 9-1. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who commanded the coastal defenses, boasted that any attempted invasion would be destroyed on the beaches. The Atlantic Wall seemed impregnable.
General Eisenhower and his staff had another problem to face: the weather. On June 1st, a storm front moved into England and brought choppy seas and squalls to the Channel. The bad weather forced a 24-hour postponement of the invasion, but on the morning of June 5th, Eisenhower sent the largest armada in the history of the world toward the coast of France with the simple phrase, "Okay, let's go." The invasion force would strike at dawn June 6th, where the enemy least expected it, Normandy.
The order to go galvanized the elements of the assault force into action. Ships and landing craft left the harbors for their assembly points in the Channel. Air crews received final briefings for their bombing and transport missions. Diversionary forces began an operation to confuse enemy intelligence about the location of the invasion, and airborne units prepared for their night jump behind the targeted beaches. General Eisenhower spent the last afternoon before D-Day with his paratroopers. They were to take part in the biggest airborne assault ever mounted and would be the first American soldiers on French soil. Their mission then, as it might be today, was to jump behind enemy lines, secure transportation routes for the invasion forces, and cut the enemy's counterattack routes to the beaches. Schuyler Jackson, a veteran of the 101st Airborne Division, remembers that mission well.
We had our pork dinner, greasy pork chops. And then we had that about 6. Then they said that the operation was go. So we got all our equipment on. We had to help each other up in the plane because we couldn't get up in the plane with all that equipment. We got in the plane and then we sat for a while until everybody was ready. Then about 8:30 we took off. And when we took off, we had to circle round and around and around England for about 4 hours because we were the first wave in, and we had to wait till all the units got in line, and they give us the word, stand up and hook up, and anybody said they weren't scared, they're damn liars, because I was scared. And I was never so glad to get out of a plane in my life. And after I got out, I was fine. It was just that idea of flying over there, and you could hear the bullets hitting the wings of the plane. It'd make a sharp pop. I landed amongst a bunch of cows. And in the next field, there was an anti-aircraft battery, German anti-aircraft battery that was shooting, and there wasn't any problem going after them because we just threw grenades in them and knocked it out.
Another special operation designed to pave the way for the invasion forces was conducted here at Point du Hoc, between the American landing beaches. The 100-foot-high cliffs had to be scaled by 3 companies of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, led by Colonel Earl Rudder. Their mission, to destroy a battery of long-range coastal guns threatening the invasion forces.
Leonard Lomel was a ranger from D Company during the cliff assault that was later dramatized in the film The Longest Day.
They started to land us at the wrong beach, at the wrong point. Colonel Rudder, my battalion commander, discovered this error and corrected it right away and brought the boats parallel to the beach. And we then traveled northwardly along the beach to Point du Hoc. As we approached the cliffs, the Germans were firing on us from their positions. And when we landed at the base of the cliffs, this isn't very much of a beach, you know, they were dropping grenades on us as we were hustling to get up the cliffs and beat them back and stop that sort of thing. And when we got up there, we got to the gun positions and were horrified to find that there weren't any guns there at all. A group of us, D Company of my group, made our way to the coast road. Well, that road led to a draw, a little valley, a little orchard, an apple orchard. And in this little draw or valley or vale or whatever you wish to call it, were all 5 of those coastal guns in position. And our Rangers destroyed those guns, and another patrol blew up the ammunition.
More than 3,000 bombs were dropped on Point du Hoc to soften up the enemy. Yet it took the courage and determination of the individual soldier to carry the day. Of the 225 Rangers who began the climb up the cliffs, only 90 were in any condition to fight by nightfall. They were perched between the 2 American beach objectives, Omaha on the east, Utah on the west.
Omaha Beach, later called Bloody Omaha, was not a good place for an amphibious landing. Cliffs 100 feet high dominated each end. A 300-yard stretch of open beach was uncovered at low tide. It was filled with obstacles designed to block or sink landing craft, ditches to stop tanks and other assault vehicles, and concertina wire and mines to slow the landing forces. Weapons positions covered every square inch of the beach. They included high-velocity 75mm and the feared 88mm guns that were protected by concrete walls 3 feet thick and could pour flanking fire down the entire beach. Strong points overlooking the beach consisted of pillboxes, gun emplacements, mortar pits, firing trenches, light artillery positions, and anti-tank guns. These were all surrounded by barbed wire and minefields and connected by tunnels or deep trenches. The machine gun was the enemy's basic weapon on Omaha Beach, but the defenders could also bring to bear flamethrowers, multi-barreled rocket launchers, and obsolete French tanks buried flush with the ground. The beach installations were only the first line of defense. A string of villages behind Omaha formed a second, and flooded fields further back a third. The Americans would have to overcome all of these to avoid being bottled up on the beach. The task fell to the troops of the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, one of the Army's toughest and most experienced outfits, and the 29th Infantry, an unbloodied National Guard division filled with men from Virginia, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. Mifflin Clough, who commanded a company of guardsmen during one of the initial assault waves, recalls the events just before his troops hit the beach.
We got us up about 2:30 in the morning, and we had breakfast, those that could eat, and got all of our gear together. Well, the channel was so rough, it swells up and down, particularly for the men going down the cargo net. When you get down to the bottom and thought he could step into the LCVP, it may be 6, 8, 10 feet below him, or maybe up even with him. So it was a lot of them was falling in. Once the battalion got offloaded, we went out and started circling until everybody that was in the assault wave was in the channel making their circles. And the Navy then guided us in.
As their landing craft neared the beach, the troops could hear the sounds of bullets bouncing off the steel ramps. As the ramps dropped, they could see the surf being punctured by the enemy's fire. They could feel the shock waves of exploding shells. Men jumped or stumbled into water 6 feet deep. Their heavy equipment dragged them down. Some drowned then and there, or were hit by enemy fire. Those that made it safely to shore could find no cover and moved back into the water with only their heads sticking out. In less than 30 minutes, the engineers who were to clear gaps through the obstacles suffered 40% casualties. One company of the 29th Infantry lost 96% of its men within the first 10 minutes. As the tide crept in, the press of men on the beach became worse. Too exhausted and shocked to move, their leaders dead or wounded, the troops were slow to rally. As more boats came toward the beach, they were easy targets for the enemy's guns. Many were blown out of the water. The issue was in doubt at Omaha Beach. Then, in the midst of all the confusion, small, isolated groups began to move forward slowly, across the beach and up the bluffs. A lieutenant and a sergeant led 300 men, coolly and bravely under fire, through barbed wire and over a mined track where one false step meant death or serious injury. There were many false steps that day. The wounded lay where they fell for fear of setting off other mines and killing or wounding their buddies. One commander told his men, "There are two kinds of people on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." In the midst of confusion, bravery, initiative, and discipline took over. The troops rallied and pushed forward. By dark, they had a precarious hold on the beach. General Omar Bradley said later that every man who set foot on Omaha Beach that day was a hero.
In combat, things don't always go according to plan. Equipment breaks, people get lost, bombs fall in the wrong places. Normandy was no exception. Bad weather and confusion caused many of the paratroopers to be scattered and land far from their drop zones. During the landings, poor visibility, anxiety, and the inexperience of many of the boat crews resulted in units landing on the wrong beaches, hundreds of yards from their objectives. But there can be no doubt that the overall support provided by the Air Force and the Navy was one of the major reasons for the success of the operation.
On Omaha, the Corps commander's first message to General Bradley said, "Thank God for the Navy." 12 destroyers, disregarding all the rules and their own safety, had steamed in close to shore through mines and other obstacles. Under direct enemy fire, and with only inches under their keels, they began to trade punches with the bunkers holding up the American troops' advance. On Utah, the ships laid down a covering bombardment for the 4th Division's landing. They also fired with deadly accuracy at enemy gun positions pinpointed by Army spotters. This fire support, plus the less difficult terrain and weaker enemy defenses, allowed Utah Beach to be taken with far fewer casualties than expected. But Utah was no picnic either. One of its heroes was the oldest soldier and only general to land in the first waves. 57-year-old Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. was no ordinary soldier. Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry, son of President Teddy Roosevelt, cousin of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He had already participated in landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Corsica. A small man with a bad heart, an arthritic shoulder, and a rough voice, he had persuaded General Bradley to let him land, and in his words, steady the boys.
Armed with only a pistol and a walking stick, the little general moved up and down the beach, waving a map, looking, someone said, as if he wanted to buy some real estate. He reassured the scared and seasick young soldiers of the first wave. Later, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for his heroic actions under heavy fire that day. He lies here in the French soil he helped to liberate, along with thousands of others who died at Normandy.
Of the more than 130,000 Allied troops who landed on D-Day, 2,500 Americans were killed and 3,500 more were wounded. There were 3,000 casualties on Omaha Beach alone. Their sacrifice and the tenacity of the survivors gave the Allies a foothold in France, a beachhead through which poured reinforcements and support elements. Within a week after D-Day, nearly 330,000 men, 55,000 vehicles, and more than 100,000 tons of supplies had been landed. By August 1st, the armies that had established the Second Front were strong enough to break out of their beachhead and begin the liberation of the rest of France. On August 24th, Paris was liberated, and in less than a year, the Allies who had landed in Normandy joined with those from the Italian campaign to capture Berlin and end the war in Europe. General John Vesey, Jr., now chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was a first sergeant during the Italian campaign.
I can tell you that the soldiers in our outfit were absolutely top-notch. They wanted to win. They were tough physically, and after 2.5 years of war, you couldn't be anything else and still survive. They were loyal Americans, patriotic soldiers. And I think we need the same sort of soldiers today that we needed in World War II. Tough, well-disciplined, well-trained, people that are able to use the weapons and technological assists they have to the best possible advantage to gain an advantage over the enemy.
What the general is talking about is evident here and at hundreds of other Army installations throughout the world. Soldiers training and preparing every day for any contingency, anywhere, with the right equipment, the right support, and the right skills.
Army Chief of Staff General John Wickham, Jr. is charged with this important responsibility. He has definite opinions on how to accomplish the Army's objectives for the 80s and beyond.
Just as in Normandy, readiness is an important mission for the armed services and particularly for the Army. We've got quality people, and we're now beginning to emphasize quality in equipment. We're beginning to bring this new equipment aboard, not only for the active Army, but also for the reserve components. Training, of course, is one of the key elements to a high state of readiness. The National Training Center that we have in Fort Irwin is probably the best training in the world. More money is going into improved ranges, into simulators, so that we can improve training throughout all kinds of garrisons. In short, we really don't have time to prepare for the future. We have to be ready now. Grenada was a case in point. Less than 3% of the 2 Ranger battalions that parachuted in had ever heard a shot fired in anger, and they performed superbly. When we have young men and women like that, with that kind of sense of value and sense of commitment, I think our freedoms are well protected. When I went around to pin decorations on the wounded Rangers and Airborne soldiers in the hospital, one young Ranger badly wounded, after I put the Purple Heart on his pajamas and the combat infantry badge, and the photographers were about to take a picture, he reached into his pocket and said, "Wait a minute," as he did that, pulled out a small American flag that had been sewn on the left sleeve of all of the soldiers, put that little flag up above the combat infantry badge and pointed to it, and then said to the photographers, "Go ahead and take your pictures, because this flag is what I'm proudest of." Soldiers don't change much, and the soldiers we have today are just as committed, I believe, as those brave soldiers who went into Normandy.
Though the battle for these beaches has been over for 40 years, the memory of those who fought and died here on Omaha and Utah will live on. June 6, 1944, will be remembered as one of the finest examples of America's military heritage. But there's more here than just a history lesson for you soldiers of today's Army. For the principles of preparedness, initiative, teamwork, and the determination to succeed are just as important to you today as they were here on D-Day. For Soldiers Television Magazine, I'm Peter Hackus.
This is not the end of the story. In 11 months, the war would end. From the ruins would be built the great NATO alliance. Former adversaries would become vital allies. And today, in that great alliance, we stand together to safeguard freedom against those who would deprive us of it, those who threaten us, such as the Warsaw Pact.